Well, thank you so much, Francine, and hello, everybody. Hello. It's really wonderful to be with you here today. Thank you for joining us for this very important topic. I am Catherine Blakespear, and I serve as the state senator representing this whole area. So I live here in Cardiff, and I represent northern San Diego County and southern Orange County, almost 1 million people. And this event has drawn more response than any event that I've held in my 2 years as a state senator. So just shy of 700 people RSVP'd for this. And as you heard, we have more than 400 people on Zoom and then a packed house here. So you really see how this topic resonates for so many people with a lot of questions and wanting to know more and understand what the law is and what it could be. And I'm thrilled by the quality of our panel. We have tremendous people here who are going to be speaking about this, and I expect that you really will learn a lot. So I just want to say a little bit about an introduction about who I am before we move on into the core topic. So I worked as a journalist and also as an attorney before I started my career in elected office. I was in local government for 8 years, 6 as the mayor of the city of Encinitas and 2 on the Encinitas City Council. And before that, I worked as an attorney and I had an estate planning law firm where I would draft advanced healthcare directives. So I had many conversations with clients about what are the circumstances under which you would not want to be resuscitated? What are the circumstances where you would want to make certain types of end-of-life choices? And in addition to that professional work, I also have a very close relationship with my grandma, who's now passed, and with my mother, Tricia Smith, who's right here, and my Aunt Rosemary Kimball, who's in the back. Both of them, raise your hands so we can see you. Both of them having hours of, yes, let's give the both, yes. But a lot of people having put a lot of thought into this, and I have had a lot of those conversations in my own family about what is it that they want at the end of life as they are starting to decline, as they have disease, or as they are facing our final exit. What kind of an exit do they want, and do we want as a family? So this topic is really important to me because it's really important to you, but it's also important to me personally. And so I'm just really happy to be able to be here today to talk about what are the choices in California. So in California, since 2016, we've had the End of Life Options Act. And as you'll hear more, this law allows people with a prognosis of less than 6 months to live to have the option to request a prescription medication to end their lives. Last year, 1,281 Californians received such a prescription, and not everybody took it. So several hundred people pass before they take it or decide not to take it, but they have it for their ability to make that choice about their own medical autonomy if they want to. There are 9 other states and DC, Washington, DC, that have similar laws. And as you may know, if you pay attention to the news every week, British lawmakers in the House of Commons approved their own version just last week. Yeah, and interestingly, I mean, it's very similar to California's law. And of course, it was tremendously controversial and multi-years, I think possibly multi-decades in the making in Britain as well. So for many people, there is a great comfort in knowing that they have the right to that bodily autonomy. And I hear from people all across the nation about this. So this is something that is very important in California, but of course it's important throughout our country. Last year, I introduced SB 1196, and that was to address some gaps that I saw in the existing law as we have it. It sought to change the requirements that you have to be within 6 months of death in order to qualify. And another one of the limitations is that you can't have Alzheimer's or dementia or other cognitive impairments that in order to qualify. So those were things that I was concerned about and wanted to address in legislation. The bill also would have allowed the option for medication to be taken by self-administered IV, because a person might lose the ability to physically swallow medication before they enter that 6-month prognosis. And if you can't self-administer it by swallowing it right now, you're not eligible. So the bill did not even get one hearing. And so what happens in Sacramento, of course, is it goes through committees, a bill does, where there are people who sit on a committee. The first committee it was referred to was the Health Committee. And it did not get a hearing. And there was really a reluctance from those around me, those who supported the earlier law, people who were opposed. And in general, it was clear to me that what we needed to do was substantially more work to build up the constituent support that was needed, and also to have conversations with the American Medical Association and the religious community and a number of different organizations that are very important and powerful if we were going to be able to make any progress really on any part of the law. And I'm just grateful in many ways that we have it in California. It was very hard to get passed here in California as well. So it didn't move forward, but I really was flooded with stories from people who reached out about that bill more than any other bill that I had last year. And those stories have motivated me to continue to work on this. So I'll be working on this next year and considering legislation. We haven't settled on what the next bill will be. So part of doing this today is to be hearing the feedback, understanding more about where people are, and just in general, the climate around this, so that we can be able to chart a course forward tomorrow. So I think that there is really some clear consensus that we would like to expand it in some way so that more people are eligible. So with that, I'm going to move on to our panel, and I look very much forward to hearing from our panelists, who are really all experts, and I think you'll very much enjoy them. So the first person is Elizabeth Uslander, excuse me. And she is at the helm of the movement to humanize healthcare by empowering patients and families in palliative end-of-life, grief, and spiritual care. As the co-founder and spiritual director of Empowered Endings Medical Group, Institute, and Foundation, she works to fill gaps in traditional healthcare and facilitate paradigm shifts in her field of expertise. She will discuss where to start in exploring end-of-life options and support for individuals and their families. So I would like to welcome her up to the podium. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you, Senator, for having us all for the introduction, lovely introduction. As the Senator mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Uslander. It's a tricky one, I know. I wasn't born into it, but I've adjusted. I think, there we are. So as she also mentioned, I'm a social worker and spiritual counselor by trade, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Empowered Endings. Empowered Endings was originally founded as a medical practice specializing in palliative and end-of-life care, in particular end-of-life options and end-of-life planning, and has since expanded into an educational institute and a charitable foundation with the shared mission of ensuring a soft landing for all who want one. My story with medical aid in dying began when I moved to California 10 years ago. At the time, it was a controversial topic with legislation under consideration. I started doing research, and I was surprised to find that the data pointed to overwhelmingly positive outcomes for patients who accessed the option and for the families in their bereavement journeys. I was inspired. So I started learning everything there was to know about the law, and the details of which you'll hear from my colleagues. And I became a passionate advocate. When the law was passed, I assumed that when it was passed and then activated in 2016, I assumed that healthcare institutions and organizations would have policies in place, that they would institute policies to ensure that patients would have access to appropriate care and support, and that the institutions like the UC system and local hospices would have an idea of what they were going to do to implement this new opportunity for their patients. I was again surprised to discover that there were no policies prepared, and everyone seemed more concerned about the legal liability of an option they didn't fully understand, and that the providers were wildly unprepared to fully support patients and families in the way that they needed. So it just so happens that my husband and business partner, Dr. Bob Uslander, who's also here with us today, was an emergency physician for 25 years before he transitioned into palliative and end-of-life care over 10 years ago. And we had partnered in private practice to fill the gaps in the healthcare system. So we started receiving calls from patients who couldn't find doctors, looking to talk with them about their options. And we decided to help. So Bob started serving as the attending physician and I as the social worker and spiritual counselor. and we began walking with people through the medical aid in dying process. In the 8 years since, we've supported many hundreds of patients and families through medical aid in dying. We've trained hundreds of doctors and other healthcare providers, and we've partnered with other pioneers in the field like Dr. Lonnie Shavelson, the founder of the Academy of Aid in Dying Medicine, which is another great resource for this topic. The landscape of aid in dying medicine has changed dramatically in the time since, with more policies, information, and providers in place, but resources still limited and sometimes still hard to find. So where do we begin? The most obvious place to look for information about end-of-life options is palliative care and hospice. These are the fields of medicine that support people with complex and terminal illness. They include interdisciplinary teams with doctors, social workers, nurses, spiritual counselors, and health aides, all of whom can or should be able to speak to the legal options available. The simplest option, which is accessible well before hospice or palliative care would be necessary, is to talk with your doctor about your wishes and their willingness to support you. Your primary care doctor or specialist, such as an oncologist or neurologist, may have the information and may be willing to support you through the process. There are also now end-of-life specialists.
Can you speak a little more to the microphone?
There are also now end-of-life specialists, though more rare. There are increasing numbers of physicians who are specializing in the fields of end-of-life planning, end-of-life options, and end-of-life care. There are also nonprofits and community organizations, such as those here today, that provide education and advocacy, including connecting people with the doctors, volunteers, and even death doulas to help guide and support them. It's always best to learn as much as possible as far upstream as possible, especially because the law doesn't require that your doctors support you through the medical aid in dying process, although they should refer you to someone who will if they're not willing to. And this is why advanced care planning and end-of-life planning are an important piece of the puzzle. So what to consider when talking with your care partners about your plans? One of the key issues is what your journey will look like. These quality of life questions are a great starting point to dive into with your planning partners, whether it's your doctor, social worker, estate planning attorney, like the senator, or even a death doula, to understand your personal goals and wishes, document them, and share them with your providers and loved ones will help ensure that you have access to the options that you want when the time comes. What are the options? My time is very limited, so I am only going to mention voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, which is one of the end-of-life options that's legal both here in California and throughout the United States. It's an alternative for people who don't qualify for medical aid in dying or who want a different kind of path. And this is something that we can discuss in the Q&A period and subsequently, but it's a safe and legal option that should be considered along with medical aid in dying as needed. So what do you need to know if you do decide to choose medical aid in dying? Since this is a relatively new field of medicine, best practices are still being established. However, our vast experience suggests that there are a few key questions you'll want to ask when considering this option. Who is taking you through the process? You want to make sure that you have an experienced physician who's available to explore your goals and wishes and advocate for you at every turn. How is everything going to be managed? Coordination of care can be surprisingly burdensome. It's helpful to get support so you and your family don't have to worry about handling everything. What level of support will you have? Many health systems and medical aid in dying providers are only available during scheduled appointments and regular working hours. As we all know, questions often urgently come up at inconvenient times. Who will your care team be that's available for help when you need it? And what might your family need? They're on the journey with you, and they might need guidance and counseling throughout the process and beyond to facilitate understanding, reconcile relationships, provide grief and bereavement care, and more. Finally, what happens when you die? Though it's not required by law, it is ideal and highly recommended to have an experienced professional with you at the time that you take the medication for medical aid in dying. This is not only to ensure smooth logistics for the patient, but also and especially to provide support to any loved ones who might be with you. I actually have 3 case studies prepared to talk about the roadblocks that people experience, how to overcome them, why accessing resources early on and getting the right support is so important. But because I am conscious of the time, I am going to mention that we can address all of those things in the Q&A, and in the event mingling time afterwards, my team and I will be here to connect on any subject, and I'm going to pass it back to the Senator.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Next, we have Dr. Donnie Moore. He is a San Diego-based physician who specializes in hospice and palliative care medicine. His practice, Eumoria Health, provides medical aid in dying, assists with voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, palliative care, and assistance with end-of-life planning and decision-making. He completed a fellowship in hospice and palliative care at UC San Diego. Dr. Moore is committed to expanding access and awareness of options that allow everyone to achieve their goals at end of life. As a physician, Dr. Moore will address medical options and what to expect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today, learning about end-of-life options. It's something I'm intensely passionate about and happy to speak about. And thank you to Senator Blakespear for facilitating this panel and getting everybody together to talk about this. So yeah, I am an end-of-life physician, specializing in end-of-life. I found myself kind of drawn more towards eat and dying as there weren't many providers doing it, and I just feel really connected to my patients in a special way in doing that. In talking about this sort of medical aspect, I think that the human aspect of this process is inextricably linked, and I really felt like the best way to kind of sort of tell the expectations of what you're going to go through with medical aid and dying is to tell the story of a patient with the time that I have. So this is actually coincidentally a patient that I was with yesterday who took the medication, and he gave me permission to tell a story. I'm going to change some of the details, but he wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of this option. So this gentleman reached out to me. It was actually his daughters did a few weeks ago, and they said that their father was not doing as well. He'd had prostate cancer for a while and had been relatively stable, as it is in many men who are older, but that it had progressed. His symptoms had worsened, and that he'd gone to the doctor, and they said that it had spread throughout his body to many areas. And they'd had a lot of conversations about his wishes, and fortunately had been able to get information about aid and dying. It's one of the issues. A lot of people can't get information, but we're still really at a loss about what to do. And so to go through this process, I sort of walked them through it. We had to have 2 visits in order to certify him. And in this first visit, we really talked through just a lot of his life. We went over who he was, things that are meaningful to him. We talked a lot about his wife who had passed away 10 years ago, just about his sort of his fears, his religious affiliations, anything that kind of made him a whole person, and how that sort of shaped how this process would go. In a lot of ways, how you live is how you die. And for him especially, these things that were meaningful, I wanted him to really lean into those with the time he had left. And I also wanted to allow that to shape what ultimately it looked like when he took this medication, and what his ending looked like. So I walked him through this process with the first visit, and again let him know what to expect. And then in order to do this, you have to also qualify. So part of this visit is ensuring that he meets these qualifications. He has to have a 6-month or less prognosis with this disease. You have to be 18 years or older, which at 88, he just barely made it over the mark. You have to be a resident of the state of California. Right now, only Oregon and Vermont allow you to not be a resident of the state. And he has to be able to self-administer this medication. So he's able to drink at least about 2 ounces. So we went through that. He met all the marks. And we sort of prepared for a meeting again a week later. At that point, we went over what the ingestion would look like. So the ingestion is when somebody takes the medication and they ultimately pass on. We went over that, talked him through it, and really planned. I think the planning part is often lost in this process. And I encourage you, if you're going through this, to really talk to your provider, talk to your family, and really plan out what this might look like. It's an important part of the step, the process. I would love to, I could wax poetic about this gentleman for a long time, because I really, really felt passionate about him. But, in the interest of time, I'll kind of move forward to once we reached yesterday when he was going to take this medication. Sort of expectations. You can't really eat much in the morning. Yes, please do. Please do.
We want people to know.
Oh, appreciate that. Yeah, there we go. It's me. Appreciate that, Matt. Matt's on the case. Quick shout out to Matt. But again, so I show up and you take some knowledge of medicine ahead of time, just as a precaution, and just so you kind of know what to expect, because I think this is one of the mysterious areas for people. You drink this medication, and it takes about a few minutes after that until you fall asleep, usually within somewhere in some as short as 2 to 10 minutes. Once he's asleep, we were there surrounded by his family. He chose to keep it kind of intimate. Some people actually do these big extravagant parties. I was talking with somebody earlier today who said, like, what if I want to have a party? And you should definitely do that. Like, absolutely. But he kept it pretty small and intimate. And so it was just his daughters and a close friend and me. And then he fell asleep. And ultimately, over the course of the next hour or so, he passed away. His breathing slowed down, his heart slowed down, and it was a very peaceful exit. I think, as Elizabeth said, it was a smooth landing. And it really, I think it's important to, know that this is available if you do have a terminal disease at this point, and that, it's your right, and that it's really, it's a very peaceful and humane way to exit. It's not for everybody, and not everybody has to access it. But, for those who feel as though they want to, go this way, it is an option. So talk to your providers about it, talk to your support network about it, and really make sure that your wishes are known, because it's a very humane way to pass. I'll be happy to answer questions during the Q&A. I know that was very abridged, but thank you for listening.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Moore. And on the questions, you should all have a card on your chair. And if you want to write down a question, I'll be moderating the question. So if you'd like to turn in your card, just raise your hand and someone will come around and pick it up. And then also, if you have questions, but you're on the Zoom, you can put them into the chat and we will also review them that way as well. There's a Q&A on the bottom of the screen if you're participating via Zoom. So the next person that we have is Reverend Madison Shockley. He is, here, should I move forward on the screen here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Nope.
All right.
If you go back one more, there's resources for.
Okay, well, we'll go with that slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
I thought the other one was more handsome.
So Reverend Shockley is the pastor at Pilgrim United Church of Christ in Carlsbad, and he is on the board of directors of Compassion and Choices. So the organization Compassion and Choices works to advance state and federal legislative or regulatory reforms to address end-of-life care for those living with dementia, health equity in end-of-life healthcare, medical aid in dying, and the integration of palliative care in ER settings. Reverend Shockley will address his perspective as a faith leader to the medical and personal stories that he has heard. Please join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blakespear, for organizing this event. It is obviously one that many, many people are interested in. And I think it's something that touches everyone's life because we're all gonna die. I have been involved in this movement for almost 2 decades. I came to Pilgrim United Church of Christ in Carlsbad in 2004, and a clergy colleague in Northern California invited me to get involved because California was trying to pass a medical aid in dying law in 2005. And I hadn't really thought about this law. I'd never heard of that procedure. But when I reflected on it from my experience with members of my church, members of my family, and the lives that they led, and more importantly, the death that they died, I said, yes, I will get involved. And I went to Sacramento to give testimony in 2005, and much of the opposition to the law was coming from, I'll say, other religious communities. And so my point as an advocate and as a pastor in the Christian tradition is to say, this is a matter of religious freedom. Everyone is entitled to their own beliefs, but your beliefs should not impose upon me or limit the exercise, the free exercise of my religious beliefs. If I believe that a loving, caring, compassionate God takes no delight in my suffering and pain, but invites me to the next realm with as much peace and grace as possible, that's my faith. And it's with that faith that I would utilize and access the law for medical aid in dying. And someone else's interpretation should not prevent me from the free exercise of my religion. So that's the first important part, that not all religious traditions have the same understandings, ideas, and theologies about life or death. And so whether it's Buddhist or Muslim or Jewish or Christian or Unitarian or of no faith, one faith tradition should, or one spiritual or religious perspective should not limit our understanding or certainly our opportunity to live our deaths the way we lived our lives. Never heard that phrase before, live our deaths. One of the things that's come to me as I've reflected now these 20 years is that death is part of life. It's not on the other side. Death is part of life, and we should live our deaths with the same dignity, purpose, and intentionality with which we live our lives. That's what I hope to be able to do. We're not all going to have that opportunity, but to the extent that we do, because we don't control what circumstances will be at the end of our lives, whether it's a sudden death or whether it's a chronic illness. But should we have that opportunity, this allows us to live our lives, live our deaths with the intentionality with which we lived our lives. And also in these years of reflection, I've scoured the scriptures of our Christian tradition. And actually, guess what? I found nothing in the text of the Bible that prohibits, denigrates, or opposes medical aid in dying. It's simply not there. Now, I know a lot of people say, oh, but suicide is an unforgivable sin, et cetera, et cetera. Two things. One, that ain't in the Bible either. That's what I call folk theology. But if that floats your boat, fine, but that's not in my Bible. And secondly, the biblical tradition has a story, the death of Saul, where he says out loud, I've been mortally wounded. He was in a battle with the Philistines, and I'm going to die. And he asks 2 different people to help him complete his death. He'd been struck by the archers. He knew that he was going to succumb. He even said to one of them, the convulsions have already started. And if the enemy catches up with me, they're going to torture me, dismember me, and humiliate me. Well, we're not fighting the Philistines, but should our illnesses overtake us, our illnesses will torture us with convulsions and other problems, dismember us system by system, circulatory system, respiratory system, and humiliate us. And so we have a law here in California, thank God, medical aid in dying, that allows us to prevent our enemy, our illness, from overtaking us and having the kind of death that reflects the kind of life that we've lived. And so I want to encourage everyone to learn as much as you can, and also to seek out as many resources as you can, because this is still in jeopardy. There's a sunset law that's going to end this opportunity, to live our deaths as we live our lives, unless we can eliminate the sunset and allow this law to become a permanent law. And last thing that I'll say, understand this: everyone benefits from this law. Whether you are going to use it yourself or not, or if you're not, you're only 30 years old and you think it'll live forever, as most 30-year-olds do, just by being in California and knowing that we have this law, you're a beneficiary. Because you know that when that time comes, you have the opportunity, because you are a resident of California, to end your life with the dignity, purpose, and intentionality with which you lived. You'll be able to live your death with the intentionality with which you lived your life. People who never get the prescription, who are ill, benefit because they know it's there. And as was mentioned by Senator Blakespear, people that get the prescription put it on the shelf because they can say, they can exhale, and they can endure as long as they choose to. But if it becomes unbearable, they can go to their medicine cabinet, they can call their family, they can call Dr. Moore, and they can live their death with that dignity, that purpose, and that intentionality. And that's why I'm a part of this movement. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend. And our last panelist we have is Janet Hager. She is a founding board member of the Hemlock Society of San Diego and founding director of A Better Exit. She is a retired physical therapist who spent the majority of her career working in geriatric rehabilitation. As the daughter and wife of veterinarians, she has seen how providing a peaceful death is both compassionate and humane. These influences, along with experiencing her husband David's death from pancreatic cancer after he had obtained but was unable to utilize California's End-of-Life Option Act medications, this led her to believe in the importance of allowing those who are suffering to die peacefully. So Ms. Hager will share her personal story and examine how the law can change to offer more options. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blakespear, for the introduction, for holding this public forum today, and for feeling strongly about authoring a bill to expand California's End-of-Life Option Act in some very specific and compassionate ways that would allow more Californians access to medical aid in dying when facing a devastating, debilitating, and progressive disease. What I will be presenting today is how A Better Exit would like to see the law expand. We will have to see what we might be able to realistically accomplish in the 2025 legislative session. So, who is currently eligible to receive medical aid in dying, which you'll also hear me talk about by its acronym MAID. So and Dr. Moore went over this, but you must be a California resident, you must be 18 years or older, have the mental capacity to make your own healthcare decisions, have a terminal illness with 6 months or less to live, and this has to be self-administered, which means that it needs to be ingested. And the American Medical Association has defined ingestion as something that's introduced anywhere within the gastrointestinal tract. So this can be swallowed or introduced through a feeding tube or a rectal tube, but the patient has to be able to manage the cup or straw if it's being swallowed, or push a plunger on a really large syringe to introduce it through a tube. Well, this seems pretty good. Why is there a problem? Why should we consider expanding the law? Because if you combine the last three requirements of the law, then it excludes many people living with a progressive neurodegenerative disease of some type. Let's first consider dementia. By the time someone with one of the several types of dementia is within 6 months of dying, they will no longer have the mental capacity to access MAID. Yet people with dementia are finding ways to end their lives for any number of personal reasons because they don't want to live once they've lost their mental capacity, once they lose who they are and who they've been their entire life. An organization called Final Exit Network sponsored a nationwide poll in 2022 to see how Americans feel about hastening death rather than enduring the full consequences of dementia. 44% of respondents endorsed a position that competent individuals diagnosed with early stage dementia should have access to a peaceful method to end their life before they lose their capacity. 31% were neutral and only 24% opposed. Final Exit Network reports that between 12 to 14% of their clients who utilize an inert gas to hasten their death do so because of early stage dementia. There are others diagnosed with dementia that will choose to voluntarily stop eating and drinking before they lose their mental capacity. This process is arduous at best, as it generally takes 10 to 14 days to dehydrate yourself to death, and it requires a large support system or expensive hired caregivers to provide care with the individual once they've lost consciousness after several days without fluids. Yet others who have the means might travel to Switzerland, which is the only country in the world where you don't have to be a resident to achieve a peaceful death.
Also the Netherlands.
No, you can't go to the Netherlands. Only Switzerland. This is something that loved ones of A Better Exit's president and vice president, Christy Golem, who's here today, did. But the most horrific statistic demonstrates that in 2022, please hone in on this one, 73% of suicide deaths in the context of dementia involve the use of a firearm. Now, let's look at how our current law might exclude someone diagnosed with a progressive neurodegenerative disease other than dementia. So those with ALS, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, and other lesser known types of neurodegenerative diseases. By the time many people with these types of diseases are within 6 months of dying, they may no longer be able to physically self-administer the medication because they either can no longer swallow or they no longer have the strength or coordination to push the plunger on this gigantic syringe that's filled with a really thick fluid medication. They can start it, they can get it partway down, nobody can finish it for them. They have to do it completely independently. For this group of people, along with those who have a poorly functioning gastrointestinal tract that doesn't absorb the ingested medication well and might take hours to die after ingestion, we need to offer an IV option, which would still be self-administered with very slight physical exertion by the person utilizing MAID. Most of the countries in the world that offer MAID have both an oral and an IV option available for patients. So these are the ways that our current law needs to expand. Allow those with progressive neurodegenerative diseases access to MAID before they lose their mental capacity or their physical capacity to self-administer the medication, and add an IV option for self-administration. The safeguards that are in place for this law are very effective. And in the nearly 28 years that MAID has been available in the US, there's not been a single case of abuse. California has a population of nearly 40 million people. In 2023, there were 884 Californians that utilized MAID. Why is that number so low compared to our population? There's a lack of knowledge about our law, and our highly restrictive eligibility criteria are barring many Californians from having a peaceful death. My husband, David, was both a veterinary radiologist and an MD radiologist. He was fond of pointing out the fact that in most circumstances, human medicine was about 15 years ahead of veterinary medicine, except when it comes to the end of life, where veterinary medicine does it better. My David was unlucky because he had pancreatic cancer. but he was lucky because he qualified for MAID. And because he did, I witnessed the level of anxiety drop and the quality of his life improve because he knew that he had the means for a peaceful death if his symptoms weren't being well enough palliated. Everyone who is facing a progressive disease that's eventually going to culminate in their death should have the option of MAID for a peaceful death. Thank you.
Well, let's give it up for our panelists. Weren't they amazing? I was so happy that we could get such high quality people who are involved in such different areas of this to speak to all of you about it, because they all bring very different perspectives and backgrounds to this topic. We've received a few questions already, and I think maybe I'll hand the microphone to you and you could just stand up to answer the question. Does that work for our tech team if they do that? I've received, if you would like to write down a question, write it on the card. Yes, there we go. So I've received a few questions already about the costs. So how much does it cost to go through medical aid in dying? Is it covered by Medicare? Is it covered by insurance? There have been several questions about that. So I'll hand the mic to one of you to answer that.
So yeah, one of the biggest challenges right now is that insurances are not covering this, and Medicare is not covering this. So for some people, some providers, that can be a barrier because it's out of pocket cost. For a lot of the providers that I know that are doing this work, though, it's addressed in a very compassionate way where, oftentimes it's an out-of-pocket cost of several thousand, but most of the people I know who are doing this work, for a fact, Empowered Endings and myself, we really work hard to work with people on a sliding scale to see people with whatever, their ability is to pay. I firmly believe that somebody's ability to pay should not really, should never be the reason that they do or do not have access to this. But I think that also, reaching out to insurances, letting, the state of California know that you'd like this covered is very important because it can be a high cost. And then outside of it, I think another thing is the medication itself is another cost. It's about $600 to $700. If you do have Medi-Cal, it will cover the cost of the medication often, but again, other insurances just aren't covering it at this time. But it's a really good question.
Follow up. If I may, I will follow up thought. First of all, we need to duplicate Janet and have her go after the insurance companies. I think that's how we solve that problem.
That's the next step.
In the interim, we have a foundation, the Empowered Endings Foundation, that does offer financial assistance. So as Dr. Moore said, the providers in this field are very compassionate. There is no insurance coverage. We all work on a sliding scale down to absolutely nothing wherever necessary and appropriate. But we also want to make sure that financial burden is never an obstacle to people receiving the care that they need, want, and deserve. So the Empowered Endings Foundation is a very small foundation now, and we're hoping to grow and make it very large so that it could cover the cost of physician care, bedside care, ingestion support, medication, and any other pieces of the puzzle like grief and bereavement for family before and after. So there's a lot of work yet to be done in terms of cost.
Okay, thank you. I think this would be a good one for the doctor too. So once you get the medication, do you have to have a doctor present to take it? And are there ever any negative reactions to the medication that could be disturbing to family members if they are there?
Yeah. So to answer the first part, no, there does not have to be anybody there with you when you take the medication. And I think that's part of the empowering part of it, is that you can take it at any point you choose. So you don't have to have a doctor there. That having been said, I do strongly recommend you have somebody there, be it a physician if they're willing and able and have the capacity to, or there's plenty of death doulas. It's a very rapidly growing field who can support patients who are taking the medication. But I think having somebody there to support you can help you in completing the process and more importantly, help support your loved ones, to really make sure that they have support and, aren't, put in a position where they feel too uncomfortable. And the second part is a bit challenging because when taking this medication, you're really, in some ways, you're hastening death. And in some ways, death doesn't always, look beautiful. And so in reactions, sometimes there can be sort of muscle tightening that happens early on. There can be irregular breathing patterns that are, a bit uncomfortable to see. But what I will say is, so once somebody drinks it and falls asleep, they're in a very, very deep, relaxed state. And so, it's got one of the components in it almost puts you in like a surgical type of sleep. And so, from what we know, these medications, you're sort of outside awareness of what's going on, of these, things that are happening are minimal once you've actually fallen asleep. So that's sort of the answers.
Okay, good. Yeah, we'll want to get through as many questions as possible. So another question is, I thought this event was going to address end-of-life choices, including not only MAID, but what about hospice and what about palliative care?
So there's actually, for those of you who are here, we actually have a book, a little magazine printout of exploring your end-of-life options, which deep dives into all of the different options. So it's at the Empowered Endings table if that's of interest. There are a lot of different options. What we're talking about today are the legal options to hasten the end of your life. So medical aid in dying is a legislated option that's available in California, 9 other states, and DC. Voluntary stopping eating and drinking is another one of the legal options to hasten the end of your life. There are also different mechanisms in the healthcare system, like palliative care and hospice care, to provide support that do not include hastening the end of your life. Palliative care, which is a relatively new field of medicine and only in the last 10 years built into the insurance model, is supposed to help people who have complex illnesses as far upstream as possible. And it's supposed to provide an interdisciplinary team of support, doctors, social workers, nurses, chaplains, all working together to support the patient's needs, the medical care and counseling, but also the family system and loved ones and support system. Palliative care is largely found in clinic. It's harder to get palliative care at home. There are palliative care programs through some of the hospices, for example, but they don't provide really robust, consistent care in home the way, for example, hospice is built to provide care. So hospice is an end-of-life care, comfort care option when you're ready to stop treatment and to allow your life to come to a natural close with as much support, care, and comfort as possible. Hospice can step in, and just like palliative care, they have an interdisciplinary team with doctors, nurses, social workers, chaplains, and health aides. They come to you. So if you're in your home, they'll come to your home. If you're in a facility, they'll come to your facility. If you're in the hospital, you can get hospice care in the hospital. And they provide support on an ongoing basis. Hospice differs from palliative care in that the care in home is more robust. That's more is covered by insurance in terms of getting care in home. But also in that you have to, like with medical aid in dying, have a terminal diagnosis with a prognosis of 6 months or less. And that's something that's determined by the physicians and providers that are managing your care.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to take the next question, which is, should I have something in my will or trust about this? And I'll say that your will is operative when you die, and your trust allows you to choose somebody to act as your agent, as your trustee, if you should become incapacitated. But you have to have capacity to use medical aid in dying. So you have to be within 6 months of death and have capacity and take the medication yourself. So having it written in one of these documents won't help you because you have to maintain all of that authority. So the next question is, and maybe we'll ask Janet to take this one, is what are the barriers preventing the improvements that were mentioned by a better exit?
Well, the barriers for dementia or any kind of progressive neurodegenerative disease are the fact that that combination, you have to be within 6 months of dying and be of sound mind. Anyone with dementia will not meet that criterion. If you have dementia and you concurrently get pancreatic cancer, then you might qualify if you are still in the early to mid stages of dementia. But dementia alone will not get you there. Barriers for others that have something like ALS or Parkinson's disease or muscular sclerosis are that you have to self-administer, which means that you have to either be able to swallow. Some people with ALS can no longer swallow when they're within 6 months of dying. They may also not be able to push down the plunger on that syringe, and nobody else can do that for them. And that's why we'd like to see an IV option as well that would require much less physical exertion than pushing down this plunger. So those are the current barriers.
No, thank you. I mean, the reality is there are many political barriers to changing the law, which are that we have a very conflicted relationship with death as a collective. And there are a lot of differing opinions about what people should be able to do and what kinds of interventions we should have. I mean, one of the really important conversations that I had with my mom is she was pointing out that a lot of people are kept alive basically because of interventions. So we've defined interventions to mean if you fall into a state of maybe unconsciousness, are you then brought back to life? But really the reality that people wouldn't be living as long as they are in the conditions they are without a whole series of interventions at really every level. There's social determinants of health, as well as the medications we take, as well as the support structures around us in nursing homes and this kind of thing. So, we have created a system in a certain way, which is largely to keep people alive as long as possible. So having this conversation, I feel like, interestingly, people even who are very strongly about medical autonomy when it comes to right to choice, right to decide when people want, when and whether and with whom to have a child, that does not necessarily extend to having thought very much about the issue of medical autonomy at the end of life. So there's a lot of work to do in this area, but it's also about, in passing laws, you have to have a number of different constituent groups that support, and also organizations that represent, for example, doctors. Like the AMA, the American Medical Association, in 2016 was able to come to neutral on the bill that passed. They moved from opposed to neutral after much, much work, but not to support. And so they were firmly opposed to the bill that I introduced last year. So working with those types of organizations and groups that have a strong presence in Sacramento is part of what the work is. So that's why it might seem obvious to some that, well, this should happen. Why doesn't it? It's because of all the barriers that we have. Okay, so let's have a couple more questions here. So in case of changes to the law, who should I contact to get updated info about medical aid in dying? Do any of the organizations want to take that? Yeah.
Yes. Please contact compassionandchoices.org. There are many resources there that you can access even now as you prepare, because when we talk about the choices, it's about your own preparation. Barbara Coombs Lee wrote an excellent book called Finish Strong, and I recommend it to all of you. Finish Strong, Barbara Coombs Lee. And my favorite chapter in her books is entitled Talking About Death Won't Kill You. And but it is about your being prepared. That's where it starts. It starts with you and you taking the initiative to get as much information as you can. And there are many resources, videos, documents, advanced directive templates for whatever state you're in. Compassionandchoices.org has plenty of resources. That's one place you can go.
I would add that's an excellent place to go. And I would also add the Academy of Aid in Dying Medicine, which has robust amount of information, education for community members, healthcare providers, anyone interested in learning more about medical aid in dying and the field of medicine as it's evolving.
Thank you.
the Academy of Aid in Dying Medicine. The website is on one of the slides, and it's just acamaid.org at the very end of mine.
We'll also send this out over email to everybody who RSVP'd for this. So you'll get all this information as well as contact information for them if you'd like. Yes.
Yeah, of course. And because we're in California, I would just like to add that for those of you who are interested in seeing how the law might progress, please go to a Better Exits website, and you can sign up and support. You can get newsletters. You'll find out how we're doing on trying to make any of the changes that I spoke about.
Thank you. This is for the Reverend. What do you think the temperature is in general in the interfaith community for expanding medical aid in dying?
I think it's growing. Absolutely. Most of the mainline churches are certainly sympathetic to the law. Some have gone as far as our own denomination, United Church of Christ, passed resolutions at their synods or annual gatherings in support of the law. And so it's growing. The unfortunate part is one slice of the religious community has a very large megaphone and a whole lot of money. So you hear from them out of proportion to their representation, not just in the religious community, but in the society at large. And so you have religious folks telling non-religious folks how to live and how to die. And so that's the problem as I see it, but there are many people of faith that support medical aid in dying.
Thank you. And another question is, why does Compassion and Choices oppose expanding this?
We are very committed to expanding the law here in California, one, by eliminating the sunset rule. And for many other states across the country, the society is at a tipping point. And we've been able to come this far through a lot of hard work and a lot of deep research that lets us know what kind of safeguards are necessary so that the bill can be passed in legislatures across the country. And so that's why we oppose at this time expanding the law, because A, we still don't have permanently here in California, and B, this is the tested and tried formula and set of protections that the current society and political scene requires for us to be able to get this law in other states that want it. We've had bills in legislatures, for example, Maryland, where one legislator, the bill was absolutely tied. One legislator prevented the bill from passing. We've had bills that were passed by the legislature where the governor refused to sign it, even after it had passed. So it is very difficult to get these laws passed in the states in our current political moment, not to mention that we have Project 2025, we have Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, who's written a whole book opposing medical aid in dying. So we want more people to have access to medical aid in dying, and we think our best shot at expanding the law is to move forward with a set of protections, because that's the first thing that everybody says. And so we've crafted a set of protections that are passable and palatable in our current political moment.
Thank you. And I'll also just share that I think you should write down the question, because we're not really taking questions directly from the audience. But I'll also just share that Compassion and Choices is doing really great work across the whole nation. When I met with them in Sacramento, and I don't want to put words in your mouth because you actually represent them, I don't, but I'll share that there's very much a fear of the law being overturned completely in court. The way it's drafted right now, it has been upheld, but if it's modified in certain ways, there's a fear that it won't potentially survive a court challenge, and that the courts are increasingly hostile in some ways, especially federal courts, to the things that California is trying to do. And as was mentioned, a Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch, he wrote a full book on his opposition to medical aid in dying, and what he termed assisted suicide and its lack of morality, and this a whole legal analysis of this, which is very long-standing for him. It was when he was a grad student, I believe, at Oxford or Cambridge, he wrote all about this. So anyway, there's a concern that they are looking for a case to send to the Supreme Court. So I think that's another reason that there's reluctance. But I'll also just say that in Sacramento, a lot of the things we do, there's a perception that they are at risk of being overturned in the courts, like our gun safety laws. And we do them anyway, because we are doing things that we think are important to protect public safety or to further California values in a bunch of different ways. So I think it's important not to be scared off from making important changes because of a fear of litigation. So it's just important to be smart about what you choose to move forward with. And one of Compassionate Choice's top priorities is to extend. So right now there's a sunset and it's in 2031. So as we, come up on that with 6 years to go to that point, we definitely need to be making sure that we extend it or eliminate the sunset completely. Okay, so here's another question. How can we support family members who disagree with their loved one's decision?
Can I answer that? Yes.
I got that too.
Seriously, I love Barbara, but that's not why I'm saying it. The way you can support family members who oppose, was the question, who oppose medical aid in dying?
It just says disagree with their loved one's decision, but I think it probably is that the person wants to take it and they don't agree.
When I tell people to buy the book, Finish Strong, I tell them to buy as many books as they have children. Seriously, and to give it to each one of your children. The book is not a book about medical aid and dying. I should make that clear. It is a book about dying, but about dying in a way that, again, represents your own values and your own purpose and intentionality and so forth. Maybe 10% is about medical aid and dying, but it's about dying. And as I mentioned, talking about death won't kill you. The best way to support your family members is to let everyone know what you want. And so while advance directives aren't legally binding, it's something that they can read that is in your hand and signed by you that lets them know this is what I wanted. And I've been there. My father died at 88, a good long life, in 2011. And I couldn't even get my sister to agree to hospice. And I saw him suffer. And he was finally enrolled in hospice 3 days before he died. But that allowed him to leave the hospital and come home and die peacefully in his own home, surrounded by his family. And so but he didn't have an advance directive. He hadn't talked to all of us to let us know. So that's the main way. Advance directive, write it down, but constantly, as you approach that date, talk to your family and let them know what you want.
Thank you so much. That is true. I will say definitely write it down, talk to your family, let them know what you want. In the moment, if you're in a situation where you haven't done that, or you have and they still are uncomfortable with your choice, one of the things that I think is most important is to help them understand what you're experiencing. A lot of times, if it's not just a flatly moral or religious objection that can't be argued logically and won't change, a lot of times people don't understand what their loved ones are facing on a daily basis. And they don't understand what they're feeling, and they don't understand what's motivating this choice. And they might misunderstand their motivation and intention. And they might not be ready for the end of their loved one's life to come, in the same way that the person who is dying might be ready. And so my recommendation would be engage the social workers and chaplains in your care team if you have them. Help facilitate conversations with your families so that they can understand what you're experiencing and you can come to some sort of alignment. Even if you don't agree in the end, you might feel more comfortable making the choice that you're making, and they might feel more comfortable making their own choice too.
Thank you. One of these cards says an additional resource is the End of Life Choices California. They have an information phone line, a website, and volunteers available to be with you on the day of ingestion. So just to make sure everyone's aware of that resource, End of Life Choices California.
And if we could also mention Hemlock Society as well, I think that's another good resource.
Hemlock Society, yes,
Yeah, I
thank
think
you.
we have
Yeah.
some board members in the front, and yeah, another great resource for information.
Yes, thank you. And then there was a question about where would I go to learn about other end-of-life directives, like when to pull the plug if I'm in an accident. And I'll also just share that that is what estate planning attorneys do with the advanced healthcare directives. And you can also Google advanced healthcare directive and learn more about it yourself. But I think all these organizations as well would help with that. Another question is, there are many Californians who don't know about medical aid in dying, and how are we increasing awareness?
That is a problem. So we as Compassionate Choices are a national advocacy organization, but we also have some opportunities to go back into states that have already been authorized for awareness campaigns, because not everyone in the state of California knows that this is our law to this day. But those campaigns cost money. And so we have invested most of our resources in expanding the law to new states that don't have it. But we are dependent upon our volunteers. We're dependent upon you all for supporting in whatever way the expansion of the law. Myself, I tell my clergy colleagues, I don't care how you feel about it personally, but believe me, members of your congregation are going to access the law, and they're going to ask you to accompany them in that journey. And so you need to learn about it. You need to talk about it. You need to let your congregations know that it's the law, and you need to educate yourself about it so that when their time comes and they call you, as they do all the time, you're prepared to be with them in that time of their greatest need. So one of the free ways to do it is, again, talk to your children, let them know.
I think Janet has. Yeah.
So End of Life Choices California, who has had a table here today, did a survey about the number of people in California that know that we even have medical aid in dying. It's 25%. So there are speaker bureaus. Hemlock Society of San Diego has a speakers bureau. End of Life Choices California has a speakers bureau. A Better Exit will come and speak. So we will educate. If you live in an adult congregate living facility or an assisted living facility, you want us to come and speak, contact those organizations, and they will provide a speaker to educate people in your facility. Retirement communities, we'll speak anywhere. Call us. We will speak.
I would add that so everyone here, everyone who's represented here can come and speak on these subjects, but there's also Empowered Endings has built an online community as well. And we're trying to bring people of all of these different organizations, everybody who's doing this work together so that we can all find what we need. So if anyone's looking for any question regarding end-of-life options, regarding end-of-life care, regarding palliative care, regarding any of the fields of our expertise and beyond, that we could go to one place and we would be able to find the answer to all of these questions. So you wouldn't have to see little like moles popping up, each of us answering one, but you would be able to get to all of them. So that's another thing that we'd like to help facilitate, is bringing everyone together so that we can have everyone go to one place, and that we're all working really closely together to make sure that more people have the resources and information they need.
Okay, hold on.
Of course. It's a billion.
Okay, I think this is her question, which she really wants me to answer. Have you answer? Okay, so the medical opposition exists because billions of dollars are spent in caring for persons with incurable diseases so that they worry that their income would go down. And how can we fight this fact? Is that your question? Okay. Does anybody want to take that?
That's why it's taken so long.
Okay, I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have to let.
I'll just
okay.
say, without affirming the premise of the question, I just want to say that again, our mission at Compassionate Choices is what we call patient-directed care. You got to take control of your own care. We used to use the phrase patient-centered care, and then that looked like a bunch of professionals surrounding the patient, telling them what to do. You have to take ownership of your own care. When my father was dying, I heard the physicians propose a variety of trials. And yes, I believe in research. I think that's important. But when I asked the doctor, well, he said something about, we've seen people live for 2 years with this particular medication. I said, but what's the typical experience? Well, 3 months. So you've got to take control of your own care, and we've got to be ready. Now, again, it's very personal. My mom, I'm going to tell you right now, my mother turned 99 on Monday, and she will tell you right now, do everything. I want everything. I want to live. So it's not just the medical professionals, but you know, you have to decide and you have to take control. Don't just lay there in the bed and letting them do to you what they want. You tell them what you want out of life and what you want out of your death.
Thank you. So this is a question whose the premise is the idea of extending it to children who of all people should not be forced to suffer needlessly. So I'm wondering if you're aware of any. I haven't heard of any widespread or even small support for extending this to children under 18, but I'm curious.
Not in the United States.
Yeah.
In Netherlands.
Okay. She's saying not in the United States, but in Netherlands. Yeah, I think that, you know, the things that have come up for me in the conversations I've had are, this question was about people who are being kept alive, but there are many people who bring up the issue of, well, what if somebody wants to inherit, and so they want to stop caring for their spouse, or they don't, you know, they're basically trying to force people into death. There's more concern about coercion around forcing people into death. I think I heard that more frequently, and so there's another question here about what can
I address that though? Yeah. So yeah, we hear that a lot as well, and the basic answer is look at the data, look at the evidence. The law has been in effect in Oregon for over 25 years. Not. Pardon? 28. Yes, over 25, I think is it. And not one case has been prosecuted. I don't know if any cases have been brought of that kind of coercion. Just no evidence of that.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, I just also want to speak to it. It's also just not like the reality of what we're seeing. Like, you know, as a provider, that's something that I'm sure a lot of the providers who do this are screening for, and you know, we're really checking in with patients. And to be honest, a lot of patients are pretty excited about the prospect of it. And it's a bit abstract to really conceptualize of, but patients are really looking forward to this in an odd way, you know, and it's so the notion that they're being coerced into doing this is just patently false from, you know, just the experience and data as well, but also just the experience of it. There's so much more often people trying to be talked out of it. That's the reality, that people are being talked out of the decision to do it.
Yeah, and I think that gets really to this next question, which is how can we, those of us here at this table, work together to expand end-of-life choices? And I think that, you know, part of that is to tell the stories of what it is, what is happening in reality, so that this other, it's almost disinformation, but it's this perception of something that could be happening that really isn't happening. But I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that question. What can we do to work together to expand end-of-life choices?
There you go.
Okay.
Well, I'll circle back to that, but let's answer this first one. Yeah.
So I think in my experience, I'm a social worker by trade. So my brain always goes to systems. And I think the key is partnership. What we're experiencing here today is a bunch of different people from a bunch of different backgrounds and a bunch of different organizations coming together, partnering with our community and our community leaders to share information, to show up for each other, to help gain understanding, and to help move things forward. And that's something that we're all doing. I mean, all of the organizations that are here represented today, including the organizations that are not at this table, we're all working to make this movement go forward in a way that really honors the humanity and the dignity of life and death and how connected they are. So I think partnering more closely, more frequently, we're all working to share education all the time, which makes a huge difference. Even if it's just a small footprint, each little step matters. And hopefully the future will just bring more of what we're seeing here today.
Yeah. And as the Reverend mentioned, there are organizations that oppose medical aid in dying in general, and they are extremely loud, but they don't necessarily represent the people that are within their organizations or within their congregations. 70% of Catholics support medical aid in dying, and yet the Catholic leadership will oppose medical aid in dying. And so we need organizational support. So those of you that belong to organizations that you think might be interested in this, let us know, because we need to approach them and get their support and show that we do have that support.
I think the participant in the back wanted a little fuller answer to why children are not included. Does anybody want? I'll just okay. Yeah.
No, you can take,
I was just gonna. I think legally and also morally, we put children into a different category than adults because we conceive of them as not being able to make their own decisions. And so this is, I mean, in some ways, I think that not allowing this for children is part of a large number of things that we consider capacity to really be fully formed at 18 or 21, depending on what it is. So do you want to answer? I mean, you might disagree with that, but I'm just saying this is why I think it's probably not, this isn't likely the next frontier.
It's certainly not a fun question. Children suffer, and it's awful, and they shouldn't. And this whole issue is about relieving suffering, and the moral, legal, and ethical dilemmas around what's available for children, from children, with families, in palliative care, in the care systems that are treating the children that are dealing with these complex and terminal illnesses. It's so complicated, it's so nuanced, and I think it's just scary for a lot of people to consider approaching if they're not really well informed about those nuances and the variables and how to safely address the questions that come up, because they're very complex. They're very complex.
Yeah, thank you for that answer.
Yeah.
This next question, and also, so if your question didn't get asked exactly, some of these questions are similar. So I feel like some of them have been answered already, but we are trying to get to and have actually been able to get through a lot of them. So I appreciate that. This one says, should bodily autonomy include medical aid in dying? As a state senator, is it in your power to add MAID to the pro-choice amendment? And what I would say is, just to frame the answer to this, is that politics is the art of the possible. So I want to be effective, and I work to find the ways where I can move and actually make progress. I would say adding this into a pro-choice discussion would not be effective. So I think it needs to have its own path. And I think that's probably true also as we talk about what about Alzheimer's, dementia, and other cognitive impairments, that it having a separate path from medical aid in dying as it stands, the End of Life Options Act, might allow for it to be managed differently and therefore not put that part at risk. So I wouldn't see that as being probably what's most likely to happen. Here's another question. So does MAID exclude persons with severed spinal cords who cannot move their arms? Does the doctor want to do this?
Right here.
Well, right, yeah, I would say, by definition, it doesn't really preclude you from doing it. But I will say that you have to have some way to administer this medication. And so if you are unable to move at all, then, if you have no way of, say, giving the medication to yourself via syringe, via rectal administration, because as was mentioned earlier, you can orally take the medication, you can do it via a G tube or some other tube that is into the intestinal tract, or rectally administer it. So if there's no way to go through one of those three routes physically, then you cannot complete the process right now.
There's been a lot of stuff written up. So you can do it.
Yeah.
With your tongue.
So there in my experience working with people who have had physical limitations, there are ways to support people in moving their body that don't include their hands and arms. I've seen in an ALS patient a contraption that was connected to his head, and he was able to push the syringe down using the force of his neck. As Dr. Moore has mentioned, the providers who are going through this process with people are very compassionate, and we want to make sure that people get the care that they need and deserve. So if there is a way and it's within the law, chances are someone's thought of it or there's a way to figure it out.
Thank you. So we'll just take two more questions here. So lots of data is collected about the current law, who uses it and why and where, but very little of that data is reported. What can we do to get more info released? Or do you feel like it is released? Yeah.
So part of why we had a sunset clause in the current law was so that data could be collected and we could make sure that there weren't any cases of abuse. So every year in July, the Public Health Department of California is mandated to collect all the data on who utilized medical aid in dying, and they have incredible amounts of information. So if you go to the Public Health Department of California's website, and we could potentially provide that in some of the follow-up information, you can find what percentage of people were 60 or older, what percentage of people were 50 and older, what percentage had cancer, what percentage had respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease. It's broken down and very well provided.
So the data is there if you want to search for it, basically. The management of many retirement communities limits organizations' ability to educate seniors about MAID. How can we get advocates into these communities to spread the word?
That's difficult. Yeah, it's Hemlock Society of San Diego. No, the people do not like that name. They don't want somebody that has that name coming in and speaking. So we are barred from a lot of different facilities to go in and talk. How we can get them to do that? I have people who have come up with their own name. Positive Passings or Inquiring Minds, and they will pull in a speaker to speak about medical aid in dying or other ways to hasten death, and do it within their own club. So that's one way.
Sorry. Another way that works really well is to talk about all the options. Rather than going in directly and speaking only to one option, speaking about all of the options. This is one of them. Frequently, if you go into a community and speak about all of the options, you'll have many follow-up questions about this option. And because you're already there and the people who are administering or the administrators for that community are also there and witnessing the interest, you may get invited back. Another way to do it is to focus on the partnership. Right. So my husband is a physician, I'm a social worker and spiritual counselor. We often go into places and talk about how we partner in providing care. It just so happens that we provide care that's palliative and end-of-life care focused. And so even if you're even more obscure about the topics at hand, if that happens to be your field of expertise, being able to speak to how you meet people in your community can really work in a lot of different ways and spaces that are very comfortable for people who might be more skittish about specific topics.
Thank you. And then this will be the last question, and it's broad, and maybe I'll ask all four of you to answer it if you want to, and make any concluding remarks. So if you are suffering but not dying, what can you do? So anybody want to start? Start with the spiritual leader.
That was good thinking.
No, I was talking to Dr. Moore before we got started. It is tragic when people don't feel that they have choices and have opportunities. And so the voluntary stopping of eating and drinking is available to everyone. And that's, something that, again, frankly, personally, I didn't know until I got into this movement. That's always been legal. There's no law against it. And while it has its own limitations, as do all procedures, and death itself has some limitations, that's the only thing that comes to my mind. I'll invite Dr. Moore to expand on that. But we're trying to get the law passed in other states. Some states have, I'll call them flexible, not exactly residency laws. But I think Oregon just made some changes to their law.
You don't have to be a resident.
You don't have to be a resident in Oregon. So many of you remember the case of the young lady from California who moved to Oregon to access their law. Want to say more about medical?
Yeah, doctor.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it, but I think a seasoned philosopher might be better to answer this question, because I feel like the notion of suffering in sort of your humanity and what it means to suffer, and how sort of suffering, how much of it is tolerable throughout society, is something that's really hard. I think it's hard for the medical system to grasp with religious institutions. I think it's hard for them to sort of reconcile with. And I think also like interpersonally, with sort of seeing family members. So I don't think there's a good answer to that. I think that knowing what your options are is important. I think that a lot of this talk was around sort of expanding options, but a lot of people still don't know what palliative care is as sort of a support structure. And that palliative care can support you a lot and help with a lot of the symptoms and a lot of the psychosocial and existential stress that you're undergoing. And so I think sort of knowing resources, knowing where you can get support can help. I think that, it's a really just challenging question. So it's an issue that I grapple with, knowing people that are suffering that come to me that is it within my scope, within my power to help them get what they want always. And so I think that, planning, knowing your options sort of is the best bet, but unfortunately there's just not, sadly not great resources for some people. And I'm sorry for that.
So we know there's medical aid and dying available in California to certain people. Voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, as the Reverend has said, that is an option for people. People who can afford to go to Switzerland, you can go through their process and see whether or not you'll qualify there. And there's an organization, Final Exit Network, that will help people using an inert gas to hasten their death that are suffering. So those are the ones that I know about, and we all know about ways that people end their lives that are violent, unreliable. I would never recommend doing anything like that. So there are options, and you can find information about that on probably all of our websites. So,
thank you. Elizabeth, do you want?
I think of that answer from the perspective, again, as being a social worker and a spiritual counselor, having walked with many people through deeply painful, challenging journeys that weren't coming to an end. and also as a person who's dealt with complex illness, who's suffered a lot in the medical system. And, you know, these are all options in terms of what can we do to hasten the end of life. Very important, obviously, why we're here. I think it's also important to explore what can we do to improve quality of life. Thank you, Jennifer. So, you know, our practice is about supporting people in the final stages of life. And that often includes people who are really struggling and think that they want to die. And then when they meet with us and we introduce holistic therapies and someone comes to their home every week and someone's available to talk to when they have questions or need things to be done and handled, or, you know, manage the coordination of care, and all of these problems are solved and the burden is lifted, suddenly they don't want to die anymore. And they might still be dying. They might still have a terminal illness. It's just not with a short-term prognosis. They might still be struggling. They might still be dealing with existential suffering. They might still be trying to figure out the best way to manage their pain. Their family might still be going through anticipatory grief and complex dynamics. Those things still exist, but in partnership with connection and support and resources, those things are often palliated. Not always. Some people are super ready to die, and that's just that. And that's fine too. It's the options. It's having the options. And how we support people is a key element, I think, of this question of medical aid in dying too. You know, it's not just doctors checking off boxes and giving medication. If you listen to Dr. Moore, if you listen to Dr. Bob, if you listen to Dr. Shavelson, all of whom are physicians who practice medical aid in dying, there is a process of patient care and lots of coordination and lots of counseling, and a lot goes into showing up for people through the journey. And that's the case whether you're going through medical aid in dying or not, whether you're able to hasten the end of your life or not. And I think that that's really the most important thing that as human beings we can offer each other.
Thank you. Well, thank you again, everybody. Thank you to Mira Costa for hosting us. Thank you to this panel. Let's give it up for them. We'll be sending all the information out to you as well. Have a great night. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely.
Do you have family or something?